"I grew up in Meridian, Mississippi," David Ruffin once recalled in an old interview, speaking slowly, almost wistfully. "My sister Rita Mae and my brother Jimmy Oliver, we were known as the Ruffin family. We'd open shows for a lot of spiritual groups. Clara Ward, Mahalia Jackson, whoever came into town. It was a memory from another lifetime. Long before the hospital bed, long before the autopsy, long before anyone had to ask what really happened to David Ruffin." The 1st of June, 1991, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. David Ruffin is pronounced dead inside a hospital room. He is 50 years old. No wife at his bedside. No children holding his hand. No members of the Temptations, the group he helped turn into legends. Just fluorescent lights, medical equipment, and strangers in scrubs. The official report is short and emotionless. Cocaine-induced heart failure. Case closed. But the autopsy would tell a more unsettling story. A heart already weakened, a body driven past its limits, and clues that raise a disturbing question. Did David Ruffin know he was walking toward his own death? How does the voice behind "My Girl" end up dying alone, surrounded not by family or bandmates, but by people who met him only at the edge of his final collapse? Why did no one step in when his condition was widely known and his decline had played out in public for years? And which details inside that autopsy report were quietly pushed aside, ignored by headlines that preferred a neat, familiar narrative? David Ruffin's last 24 hours were not random. They were the final scene in a long, brutal unraveling. And the truth behind those hours is far more horrifying than most people want to admit. Chapter 1. The Road to the Tragedy. 1974 to 1991. To understand how David Ruffin ended up dying alone in a Philadelphia hospital, you have to accept a harder reality. His story did not begin with a single night of drugs and heart failure. According to people who watched his life from the inside, his death began years earlier, when the industry that once built him quietly stepped away, and the man behind the legendary voice was left to fall apart in slow motion. In the early 1970 seconds, Ruffin was still riding the aftershocks of superstardom. As the unmistakable lead voice of the Temptations, he had helped define the sound of Motown and, with it, a generation of Black American music. But fame never comes alone. It arrives with pressure, expectations, and access. Cocaine slid into Ruffin's life, not as a shameful secret, but as a constant background presence. It was woven into late-night studio sessions, after-show parties, and long tours where sleep was optional, but performing perfectly was mandatory. At first, people around him explained it away. Ruffin was difficult, they said, but brilliant, volatile, but irreplaceable. As long as the crowd screamed when he hit the first line of a song, the chaos behind the curtain could be forgiven. By 1974, that illusion collapsed. Ruffin's cocaine use had escalated beyond anyone's ability to spin it as eccentric genius. He missed rehearsals. He showed up late when he showed up at all. When confronted, he lashed out. Backstage arguments became standard. Promoters complained. Bandmates grew exhausted, caught between loyalty and survival. Then, his private life started spilling into public record. Ruffin was arrested on a domestic violence charge, confirmation of what many insiders already suspected but rarely said aloud. Motown could shape an image. It could not contain the storm forever. That same year, the Temptations made the decision they had been circling for months. David Ruffin was out. The removal was swift, and it was devastating. Overnight, Ruffin lost far more than a job. He lost the structure that had kept him barely functional. The Temptations and the label came with managers, tour schedules, handlers, and boundaries. There were people whose job it was to knock on his hotel door, to drag him to soundcheck, to notice when something was off. Alone, Ruffin had none of that. Motown, once fiercely protective of its stars, followed a familiar pattern. Without Ruffin anchoring a profitable act, the label's focus drifted. Support thinned. Opportunities grew fewer. The industry did not publicly punish him. It simply stopped calling. What followed wasn't a spectacular crash so much as a slow erosion. Ruffin tried to mount a solo career. There were sparks nights when the old magic returned and the voice that could shake an arena broke through again. But the momentum never lasted. Cocaine remained constant. So did paranoia. Ruffin started to believe people were plotting against him, stealing from him, blocking his comeback. Some of those suspicions may have been exaggerated by addiction. Others, people later suggested, were rooted in real betrayals. Contracts that vanished, money that never arrived, managers who appeared and disappeared, leaving only distrust behind. By the 1,980 the damage was no longer just emotional or professional. It was physical. Years of substance abuse carved deep into his body. Ruffin was diagnosed with heart disease and chronic high blood pressure. Doctors warned him repeatedly that his heart was under severe strain. The most alarming finding was an enlarged heart, an organ stretched beyond its normal size, a condition that dramatically raises the risk of sudden cardiac failure. Medical advice, according to those familiar with his case, was blunt. Continued cocaine use could kill him instantly. Ruffin listened. He nodded. He acknowledged the danger. And then he kept using. This wasn't ignorance. It was compulsion, layered over despair. By then, Ruffin was no longer the center of the musical universe. He was a memory with a pulse, a living symbol of what once had been. His income depended on small nostalgia tours, quick sets built around old hits, often arranged at the last minute. These shows lacked the protective walls of his earlier career. No label-assigned doctors, no security teams. No one hired specifically to watch his health. If David Ruffin collapsed backstage in those years, there was no protocol, just panic. His personal life mirrored the same instability. He had no permanent manager, no long-term recording contract, no reliable support network. Relationships with family and friends were strained or broken. Some were worn down by years of unpredictable behavior. Others simply didn't know how to reach him anymore. Former bandmates moved on, building careers and lives that did not revolve around his crises. Few were willing to reopen old wounds. Ruffin, meanwhile, remained psychologically anchored to a past that no longer existed. Isolation became the default. Fame, once suffocating, now faded in uneven patches. People still recognized his face. They still wanted to hear My Girl and the other classics. But they wanted the songs, not the man who sang them. He traveled alone. He stayed in rooms that belonged to other people. He relied on acquaintances and short-term companions instead of family. When he struggled, there was no one whose job it was to step in. By the late 1,980 the warning signs multiplied. Shortness of breath, tightness in his chest, sudden fits of panic. Each episode was another signal pointing toward the same conclusion. Ruffin understood his body was failing. He talked about death more openly. According to people who were around him, he sometimes said this time felt different, not frantic, not terrified, just heavy and final. The tragedy of this period isn't only the addiction or the medical diagnoses. It's the absence of rescue. David Ruffin was not an unknown singer scraping by in obscurity. He was a black music icon whose voice helped shape an era. Yet, as his commercial value declined, so did the industry's willingness to protect him. There was no safety net beneath the legend. No secondary system designed to catch him after the first one let go. By 1991, David Ruffin was living on borrowed time. His heart was weakened. His addiction was deeply rooted. His support system was almost entirely gone. The conditions that would define his final 24 hours were already fully in place. The tragedy of David Ruffin is not that he died suddenly. It's that for years, people could see where he was headed, and still, no one stopped the fall. The last 24 hours, how everything finally collapsed. By the morning of the 31st of May 1991, David Ruffin was no longer just worn out. His body was issuing warnings he had come to recognize over the years, but this time they felt heavier, slower, and more final. In Philadelphia that morning, when he woke up, even the act of sitting up in bed took effort. His breathing was shallow and uneven, each inhale feeling restricted, as if something heavy was resting on his chest. A dull, steady pressure sat in the center of his ribcage. It wasn't sharp enough to trigger instant panic, but it refused to fade. He stayed motionless for a while, staring at nothing, waiting for the feeling to pass. It didn't. Ruffin had lived with pain before. He had lived with fear before. But according to someone who spoke with him that day, he quietly admitted something he rarely said out loud. This time feels different. There was no dramatic plea, no desperate call for help, just a flat observation, the kind someone makes when they already suspect a line has been crossed. Still, he did not pick up the phone to call a doctor. He didn't dial 911, most telling of all. He did not reach out to family. Years of distance, broken bonds, and unresolved tension meant there was no obvious person to call anymore. No one who would automatically rush to his side. So Ruffin did what he had done for years whenever his body protested. He pushed through it. As the morning stretched into late morning and early afternoon, Ruffin met up with several people he knew in the city. These weren't lifelong friends or caretakers. They were familiar faces on the edge of his life, people connected through music scenes, past deals, and the informal web that had replaced real management long ago. No Temptations were with him, no official manager, no Motown representative. The support structure that once surrounded him had vanished. What multiple accounts later suggested is grim but consistent. David Ruffin was looking for cocaine. By 1991, this was not naivete. He had already been told his heart was badly damaged. He knew he had high blood pressure. He knew his heart was enlarged. He had been warned multiple times that cocaine could stop his heart without notice. He understood the risk. But warnings, at that stage of his life, had lost their power. There was no one left whose voice outweighed the pull of addiction or the numbness of resignation. Equally disturbing is what didn't happen during those hours. No one forced the issue. No one drew a hard line. No one called an ambulance when it became obvious something was wrong. In those rooms, Ruffin was treated less like a man in medical danger and more like a legend whose choices could not be challenged. Fame, even faded fame, still wrapped him in a shield of deference. By mid-afternoon, the signs were impossible to ignore. Ruffin's hands shook uncontrollably. His breathing quickened, short and ragged. Panic edged into his expression. He paced, then sat, then stood again, trying and failing to get comfortable in his own body. At least one person, according to later accounts, suggested going to the hospital. Ruffin refused. This refusal was not a sudden outburst. It came from years of fear and mistrust. To David Ruffin, hospitals were where people lost control of their own story. They were places where dignity disappeared under fluorescent lights and numbers on a chart. Hospitals were where you stopped being David Ruffin, the voice, and became just another patient in a gown. He didn't want to die that way. Ironically, that decision led him exactly there. He knew he was gambling with his life. But risk had become routine, and the fear of being reduced to a powerless, anonymous patient outweighed the fear of death itself. So in that moment, he chose familiarity over survival. As night fell on the 31st of May 1991, Ruffin continued using cocaine. The autopsy would later confirm it. Toxicology results showed levels of the drug high enough to be lethal even for someone with a healthy heart. For Ruffin, whose heart was enlarged, scarred, and overworked, the effect was catastrophic. His weakened heart could no longer adjust to the violent spikes in blood pressure and heart rate triggered by cocaine. The system simply couldn't keep up. This was not a gradual fade. It was an abrupt collapse. Whether Ruffin consciously understood that this particular hit could be his last is something no one can answer. What is undeniable is that he knew he was playing with something that could end his life at any moment and chose to proceed anyway. Some see that as addiction drowning out reason. Others see a deeper despair, a man who no longer believed his life could be repaired. At some point during the night, David Ruffin went down. He collapsed, and this time he did not get back up. Emergency services were finally called. Paramedics arrived and transported him to a hospital in Philadelphia, rushing him into the emergency room. There was no wife waiting by the doors. No children pacing the hall, no former group members stepping forward to speak for him. Hospital records preserved a stark reality. No immediate family member was present to act on his behalf when he arrived. Doctors attempted to revive him, but the heart they were working on had been under siege for years. It did not respond. In the early hours of the 1st of June 1991, David Ruffin was pronounced dead. He was 50 years old. The official line was simple: cocaine-induced heart failure. Yet the true horror of David Ruffin's last day lies not only in the drug that killed him, but in the emptiness surrounding him. A man whose voice helped soundtrack Black American life died without a safety net, without intervention, and without the support that had once seemed guaranteed. His death was not a sudden twist of fate. It was the inevitable endpoint of years of isolation, neglect, and quiet abandonment. By the time his heart finally stopped, the world had already stepped away. Chapter 3. The Autopsy Report. What the Body Confirmed. In the early hours of the 1st of June 1991, after doctors in the Philadelphia hospital officially declared David Ruffin dead, his body was transferred to the medical examiner's office for a full autopsy. Inside the emergency room, the basic story was already understood. His heart had failed. What the doctors didn't yet know was how long that heart had been failing and just how close Ruffin had been to the edge long before that night. The autopsy was performed later that same day. His identity was confirmed. His age was recorded, 50 years old. The time of death, listed from the hospital records, was entered without dispute. No family members attended the examination, no Motown executive, no Temptations representative, no one from the institutions that had once profited from his voice stood in that room. The official cause of death was stamped in clinical language: cocaine-induced heart failure. But the internal findings painted a much darker picture. Medical examiners noted that Ruffin's heart was severely enlarged, a textbook case of long-term strain. This wasn't a sudden change. The heart showed signs of having worked too hard for too long. Its muscle thickened in ways that actually weakened its performance. The walls of the heart had grown abnormally heavy, making it harder for the organ to pump blood efficiently, especially under stress. Further examination revealed extensive cardiovascular damage. Blood vessels showed evidence of chronic wear, pressure, and deterioration. In other words, the autopsy confirmed what his doctors had already warned in the late 1980 seconds. David Ruffin's heart had been living on borrowed time. Cocaine didn't create the problem, it took advantage of it. Toxicology tests detected cocaine at levels that would be dangerous even for someone healthy. For a man with Ruffin's heart, those levels were fatal. The drug triggered sudden surges in heart rate and blood pressure that his compromised cardiovascular system simply could not withstand. The result? Acute heart failure. Sudden, devastating. Just as important as what the autopsy found is what it did not find. There were no cuts, no bruises, no broken bones, no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had physically attacked him. The report ruled out homicide. It ruled out death by accident involving external injury. On paper, the manner of death fell under the category of natural causes, accelerated and complicated by substance abuse. In that sense, the document was clean, tidy, and final. But buried in that sterile language is a harsher truth. The autopsy did not describe a sudden tragedy that came out of nowhere. It described the final collapse of a body that had been under extraordinary strain for years, without consistent medical supervision, without enforced treatment, and without meaningful intervention when warning signs kept flashing. The report did not say who was with him before he fell. It didn't record who saw him struggling and chose not to call an ambulance sooner. It didn't ask why a man with known heart disease was left in private settings where his condition could spiral unseen instead of being monitored in a clinic or hospital. Those questions were outside the scope of the pathologist's job. The autopsy answered how David Ruffin died. It did not answer why nobody stopped the story from reaching that point. On paper, the conclusion is simple: cocaine, heart failure, death. In reality, that same document functions as the final receipt for a tragedy that had been building in plain sight for years, a legendary voice silenced not just by drugs, but by prolonged neglect, isolation, and the slow disappearance of everyone who might have had the power to keep him alive. What the autopsy did not say the silences around David Ruffin. The autopsy report on David Ruffin was clear about one thing: how his heart stopped. What it did not and could not explain was why no one stopped it sooner. And in the days and weeks after his death, that silence became louder than any official statement. One of the most unsettling questions around Ruffin's final hours is deceptively simple. Who was with him when he collapsed? Hospital paperwork lists no wife by his side, no child signing consent forms, no immediate family members standing in the hallway demanding answers. Someone had clearly been around him before emergency services were called. Someone saw him in distress. Yet no one publicly stepped forward and said, "I was the last person to see David Ruffin alive." In the immediate aftermath, the people who were around him in Philadelphia slipped quietly out of view. No television interviews, no detailed public timeline, no sworn press conferences laying out the sequence of events. Within days, the narrative hardened into a single phrase repeated across headlines: drug-related heart failure. The names of those present remained off the record. No one seemed eager to be attached to his final moments. That leads to a second, even more disturbing question. Why wasn't David Ruffin taken to the hospital earlier? By multiple later accounts, his condition had visibly deteriorated throughout the afternoon and evening of the 31st of May, 1991. His hands trembled, his breathing was labored, his anxiety escalated into waves of near panic. These were not subtle signs. At least one person, according to people familiar with the story, suggested medical help. Ruffin refused. But a refusal does not automatically erase responsibility, especially when someone is clearly in serious medical danger. Emergency services can be called without consent. That call never came until it was too late. Hours slipped by. When paramedics were finally summoned, the damage had already progressed beyond repair. His heart, already weakened and enlarged, was pushed past its final limit. That delay raises questions no pathology report can address. Was there fear of legal trouble because drugs were present? Fear of being implicated? Fear of scandal, police, or headlines? Or was it something colder, simple indifference, a belief that he could ride it out like he had so many times before? The autopsy is silent on this. It is not designed to measure hesitation, fear, or neglect. In the days after Ruffin's death, public attention turned not just to the man, but to the institutions that once revolved around his voice. Motown Records, the label that had helped build his career and benefited from his hits, issued only brief, formal words. No lengthy tribute, no deep reflection, no public reckoning with the loss of one of its defining voices. The response was restrained and distant, almost administrative. The same quiet restraint came from the Temptations. Former bandmates did not immediately flood the airwaves with detailed memories or candid reflections. When they eventually spoke, the tone was respectful but careful, focused on his musical contributions and the past, not on what happened in his final days. There was little open discussion of his long struggle with addiction, his failing health, or the fact that he died without a stable support system around him. Behind the scenes, some insiders would later suggest that Ruffin's name had become complicated. He embodied both brilliance and chaos, innovation and instability, genius and danger. By 1991, he was no longer a clean, marketable symbol of Motown's golden era. He was a troubled reminder of the parts of the industry no one wanted to revisit on camera. Silence was easier, safer. What came next only reinforced that impression. After David Ruffin's death, there was no major initiative launched in his honor to address artist addiction, mental health, or long-term medical care for aging performers. No foundation established in his name by the institutions that once relied on his talent. No industry-wide commitment to protect the generation of black artists whose bodies had been worn down in the service of hits and tours. The system did not change. It simply moved on. Meanwhile, the people who had been closest to Ruffin in his final years drifted away from the spotlight. Some walked off the grid entirely. Others continued working in music, but rarely spoke publicly about his last hours. The lack of detailed first-hand testimony fed a particular kind of speculation, not about assassination or elaborate conspiracy, but about neglect. Neglect does not make headlines the way foul play does. It leaves no fingerprints, no dramatic crime scenes, no courtroom verdicts. But it is often far more common. The uncomfortable truth beneath Ruffin's story is simple and brutal. By 1991, David Ruffin, the artist, still generated nostalgia and revenue. But David Ruffin, the man, was no longer seen as an asset worth protecting. His catalog still made money. His voice still drew applause when old tracks played. But he himself had fallen outside the circle of urgency. Without a major label contract, without a fully backed tour, without a strong management team, the responsibility for his well-being slid into a gray zone where no one was truly accountable. This is one of the darkest mechanics of the music industry. When an artist is young, productive, and profitable, they are surrounded by layers of protection handlers, assistants, tour managers, lawyers, security, sometimes even personal doctors. When they age, become unstable, or are labeled as difficult, those layers begin to peel away. Support thins, attention drifts. What's left is the illusion of independence, an illusion especially cruel for someone battling addiction and chronic illness. David Ruffin did not die because nobody knew he was in danger. He died because no one was formally tasked with keeping him alive. In the years afterward, his story was often reduced to a simple warning: drugs kill, but that framing is incomplete. Drugs did not isolate him. Drugs did not dismantle his safety net. Drugs did not erase institutional responsibility when his health clearly deteriorated. Those choices were made by people and systems that chose distance over involvement. The autopsy legally closed the question of how he died. Morally, it left the case wide open. David Ruffin's death exposes an uncomfortable reality the music business still struggles to confront. Legends are praised for what they give the world, but they are not always protected for who they are. Their suffering becomes background noise. Their decline becomes predictable, almost expected, and therefore easier to ignore. The silence around David Ruffin's final hours was not just personal, it was structural. And in many ways, that silence is more damning than any line in the toxicology report. Chapter 5: The Final Verdict. A Death Years in the Making. David Ruffin did not die because of one reckless choice on one unlucky night. That is the most convenient story. It is also the least honest. The official record says this: on the 1st of June 1991, at the age of 50, David Ruffin died in Philadelphia of cocaine-induced heart failure. Medically, that statement is accurate. As an explanation for his life and his death, it barely scratches the surface. By the time his heart stopped beating in that hospital room, the conditions that would kill him had been in place for nearly 2 decades. To understand what really happened, you have to look past the final 24 hours and trace the pattern that began long before. By 1974, Ruffin was already being described by his own group and label as impossible to manage. His removal from the Temptations wasn't just a lineup change, it was the collapse of the last structured environment that kept some of his chaos contained. Within that group, there had been a system imperfect, strained, but still present. Managers asking where he was, schedules forcing a certain rhythm, bandmates who noticed when he spiraled too far. Once that system cut him loose, Ruffin was left to control himself while battling a powerful addiction and deep emotional wounds. No long-term, enforced treatment followed. There is no widely documented record of Ruffin being placed into a sustained, carefully monitored rehabilitation program funded by Motown or his touring partners, no evidence of an industry-backed plan designed to keep him alive long-term. Instead, he cycled through brief interventions, occasional warnings, and temporary pauses. The machine never fully stopped to rebuild him, it simply waited to see if he could still perform. In the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, addiction among black artists was often framed as personal failure rather than a condition requiring collective responsibility. By the late 1,980 seconds, the consequences were measurable in blood and tissue. Medical records, and, ultimately, the autopsy confirmed severe hypertension, extensive cardiovascular damage, and an enlarged heart and organs stretched and strained to the breaking point. Doctors told him, bluntly, that cocaine could kill him in an instant. These weren't vague warnings, they were clear, documented realities. And yet, the world around him continued, as if nothing truly needed to change. By 1990, David Ruffin had no permanent manager consistently protecting his interests, no long-term recording contract that came with infrastructure, no touring arrangement that required comprehensive medical oversight. He relied on small nostalgia gigs, one-off appearances, and short runs. These shows provided money but rarely protection. If he collapsed backstage, there was no guarantee a doctor would be there. No built-in requirement for medical staff. No formal obligation for anyone to intervene beyond basic emergency response. So, when his condition worsened on the 31st of May 1991, there was no system empowered to override his fear of hospitals. No professional figure with the authority and responsibility to call an ambulance whether he liked it or not. Responsibility had been spread so thin, it effectively disappeared. When Ruffin died, there was no spouse at the hospital. No child officially documented as making decisions. A man who once traveled with entourages died with no immediate family listed as present. That detail is not a coincidence. It is the final symptom of a long, slow isolation. The autopsy recorded the shape of his heart, the damage in his vessels, the drugs in his bloodstream. It verified that his body had been in crisis for years. What it could not record was the long chain of choices, absences, and silences that made that crisis unstoppable. It did not log the 17 years spent drifting between temporary comebacks and permanent neglect. It did not log Motown's quiet distance after his death, or the controlled, limited way his passing was publicly addressed. It did not log how his story was quickly repackaged as a cautionary tale rather than investigated as a systemic failure. Dates can be listed easily. 1,974, removed from the Temptations. Late 1,980 seconds diagnosed with serious heart disease. The 31st of May 1991, clearly in visible distress for hours. The 1st of June 1991, pronounced dead at 50. But what sits between those dates is harder to measure. A long-term withdrawal of care and accountability. David Ruffin did not die because no one realized he was sick. He died because no one was required to keep him safe. In the music industry, success comes with protection until it doesn't. When artists are valuable, they are insulated. When they become complicated, their protection becomes optional. Ruffin's story fits a pattern that has shadowed generations of black performers. They are celebrated for their talent, but not consistently safeguarded as human beings. Their pain becomes a side note. Their decline is treated as sad but inevitable. The autopsy concluded that David Ruffin died from heart failure triggered by cocaine. That is true, but it is not the whole truth. He did not die from one line of cocaine alone. He died because years of warnings were treated like background noise. Because addiction was managed only when the spotlight demanded it. Because isolation replaced structured care. Because silence was chosen over confrontation again and again. The autopsy tells us how his heart finally stopped. It does not tell us why so many people and institutions allowed it to reach that point. And that gap, that missing accountability, is the most chilling part of his story. David Ruffin's voice helped define Motown, soul music, and an era of black cultural power. His death revealed the cost of being discarded by the same system that once depended on him. Not a single, sudden tragedy. A long, visible, and ultimately preventable collapse. That is the real verdict. And it leaves one last question hanging in the air, unanswered and uncomfortable. How does a man whose voice helped define an era die alone without protection, without urgency, and without anyone stepping in when it mattered most?